Parotid gland. Today we are going to discuss about the parotid gland. Parotid gland is the largest salivary gland, which is the largest salivary gland. Out of 3 salivary glands are there, namely submandibular salivary gland, sublingual salivary gland and parotid glands. These are the 3 salivary glands, major 3 salivary glands: submandibular salivary gland, sublingual salivary gland and the parotid gland. Out of which 3 salivary glands, largest one is the third one, that is the parotid gland. The parotid gland is the largest salivary gland in your body. The parotid gland is located, it is located within the retromandibular fossa. Retromandibular fossa. This is the location of the parotid gland. Location of the parotid gland is in retromandibular fossa. Retromandibular fossa is a space which can be seen behind the mandible. That's why it is named as the retromandibular fossa. Retro means behind the mandible. So it can be seen behind the mandible, in between the mastoid process and external auditory meatus or external auditory opening or external acoustic meatus. Medially, there is the presence of styloid process. Styloid process. So the retromandibular fossa is majorly formed by the ramus of mandible, mastoid process, external acoustic meatus and the styloid process. These are the 4 structures which bounds the retromandibular fossa where the parotid gland is located. So I will show you the parotid gland is located. This is the mandibular arm. If this is the ankle of mandible, the mastoid process can be seen in relation with the posterior aspect, and here above there is the presence of external acoustic meatus. External acoustic meatus can be seen in this position. Here is the head of the mandible, you can see, and this is the position. So the mastoid process we can see here, and from here there is a styloid process projecting medially. So this is the space in between, we can see this is the retromandibular fossa. Retromandibular fossa is a space guarded anteriorly by the ramus of mandible, posteriorly by the mastoid process, superiorly with the external acoustic meatus or external auditory opening, external acoustic meatus and the posterior part of TMJ, external acoustic meatus and the posterior part of TMJ. These are forming superiorly, that is external acoustic meatus and posterior part of TMJ. These are the structures forming superiorly, and medially there is styloid process. So this is a space which can be seen in between the 3 structures, majorly mandible, mastoid process of the mandible and the temporal bone. So mandible, mastoid process of the temporal bone, external acoustic meatus of the temporal bone, styloid process of the temporal bone, and the joint between the head of the mandible and the mandibular fossa of the temporal bone. So this is the space which is known as the retromandibular fossa or the parotid bed. So we can see this structure. There is a zygomatic arch. This is the position of the zygomatic arch which can be seen here. Position of the zygomatic arch which is extending from ear to the eye. So below the zygomatic arch, over the ramus of mandible, this is extending up to the upper part of digastric and carotid triangles that we have already studied. So this is the position of the parotid gland where we can see it. The parotid gland is the structure, is a gland which can be seen at the retromandibular fossa, which is bounded anteriorly by the ramus of mandible, posteriorly by the mastoid process, superiorly by the external acoustic meatus and posterior part of temporomandibular joint, and medially by the styloid process. This is the position of parotid gland. The parotid gland is a type of gland. Parotid gland is a type of serous salivary gland. Serous salivary gland. That means serous salivary means which secretes the serous secretion or the watery secretion. Watery secretion. So that it is named as the serous salivary gland, which is secreting watery secretion. The unit of gland which produces the secretion is known as acini or acinus. Acinus or acini, otherwise known as alveoli. They are the unit of a gland which produces its secretion. So the parotid gland possesses a number of serous acini in it. It is a lobulated gland. It shows the lobules. So that it is lobulated. The gland is divided into lobes by means of the connective tissue, and again divides into lobules by means of the connective tissue, and the unit is the acinus. So a number of acini together forms the lobules, lobules together forms the lobes, and the lobes together forming into the gland. So the serous secretion is, so that we can, because of the presence of the serous secretion, we can call the serous salivary gland. There are three types of glands can be seen depending upon its secretory type. It is first the serous, the other one is mucus, the third one is mixed type of gland. Serous means which produces watery secretion. Mucus means which produces the sticky secretion, and the mixed one is both, that is serous and which produces serous and sticky secretion. We can call it as the mixed type of. The serous means which is producing watery secretion, mucus means sticky secretion, mixed means both. This example for the serous salivary gland is parotid. Example is the parotid. Mucus example is the sublingual salivary gland. Sublingual is the example for the mixed type of gland. Sorry, mucus type of gland. Mixed type of gland is submandibular salivary gland. So these are the different three types of salivary glands can be seen in your body depending upon the secretion. So out of which serous salivary gland, coming under the category of serous salivary gland, is the parotid gland, which is one of the largest salivary gland. The parotid gland is situated in the retromandibular fossa. That is a position. Position of parotid gland is retromandibular fossa. It weighs about, the weight of the gland is 25 grams. The weight of the gland is 25 grams, and it is serous salivary gland which is lobulated. So these are the major introductory part about the parotid gland. It is situated in the retromandibular fossa, weighs about 25 grams. It is a serous salivary type of gland and it is lobulated. Now we will study different positions and different external features of the gland. External features of the gland. The parotid gland majorly it can be seen as inverted pyramidal in shape. It is inverted pyramidal in shape with a duct passes from its anterior part from middle of the gland. So that is the schematic representation of the parotid gland. It possesses majorly surfaces and borders, and base with an apex. These are the external features we are going to study. It possesses a base. Being a pyramidal shape, it possesses a base and a pointed apex, a broad base and a pointed apex. So it possesses a base and an apex. Now it possesses surfaces. The surfaces are named as there are three surfaces, namely superficial surface, anteromedial surface, posteromedial surface. Superficial surface, anteromedial surface and posteromedial surface. These are the surfaces of the parotid gland. There are three surfaces for the parotid gland: anteromedial, posteromedial and the superficial. The superficial is the surface which can be seen from externally, so that it is otherwise known as the lateral surface. Superficial surface is the external surface and it is otherwise known as the lateral surface. Anteromedial surface is the surface which is presenting towards the ramus of mandible, or which is resting over the ramus of mandible, as the anteromedial surface. The posteromedial surface means it is present towards the mastoid process. So these are the three surfaces. We will see the diagram of the three surfaces. If this is the mandible, the ramus of mandible, the section of the ramus of mandible, external to it we can see the muscle, the masseter muscle, and internally there is medial pterygoid muscle. So this is masseter. If this is masseter, and this is medial pterygoid. So this is a view from superiorly. We have already cutted the bone with, we can see the external aspect. This is the external aspect, this is the internal aspect. So that here we can see the masseter muscle and internally medial pterygoid muscle can be seen. And here we can represent the mastoid process. So in between we can see the gland is presenting itself like this. The gland can be seen like this. So here we can see this is one surface, this is another surface, and this one is another surface. So here the surface external most, which can be seen from externally, that is known as the superficial surface. Or the superficial surface, otherwise known as it is a superficial surface, it is otherwise known as the lateral surface. Superficial surface or the lateral surface. So this is the first surface which can be seen externally. So these are the three surfaces which can be seen externally, that is the external most, superficial surface and the lateral surface. The surface which is presenting itself towards the ramus of mandible is the anteromedial surface, and the part which is presenting towards the posterior aspect is towards the mastoid process is the posteromedial surface. So these are the three surfaces of the parotid gland: superficial surface, anteromedial surface and the posteromedial surface. These surfaces are meeting at an edges. the surfaces meeting at a point or which is forming as angles, and they are sharp edges, so that it is named as the borders. So it possesses three borders. One, this is second border, and this one is third border. There are three borders of the parotid gland, which are three borders can be seen in relation with it. I will show you the diagram for the borders. So the parotid gland can be seen like a posteromedial surface with an anteromedial surface and a superficial surface. This is superficial surface. This is anteromedial surface. This one is posteromedial surface. So these surfaces are separated by means of borders. The anterior border, posterior border, and the medial border. The anteromedial surface and the superficial surface. The anteromedial surface and the superficial surface, which is present laterally or externally. These are divided by means of an anterior border. In between superficial surface and anteromedial surface, we can see the anterior border. In between superficial surface and the posteromedial surface, we can see the posterior border. Between superficial surface and the posteromedial surface, we can see the posterior border. Between anteromedial and posteromedial surfaces, we can see the medial border. Medial border. So these are the surfaces and borders of the parotid gland. Surfaces are anteromedial surface, posteromedial surface, superficial surface. The anteromedial surface, posteromedial surface, and superficial surface. Anteromedial and posteromedial are separated by means of the medial border. Anteromedial and the superficial surfaces are separated by means of the anterior border. So the surfaces of the parotid gland are anteromedial surface, posteromedial surface, and the superficial surface. The anteromedial and the posteromedial surfaces are separated by means of the medial border. The posteromedial surface and the superficial surface is separated by means of the posterior border. The anteromedial and the superficial surfaces, are separated by means of the anterior border. These are the borders of the parotid gland. Surfaces and borders of the parotid gland: anteromedial, posteromedial, and superficial surfaces, anterior border, posterior border, and the medial borders.